hippies, nerds, cool cats, hip dogs, and everything in between. I got something just a touch different for you today. I've been working on a novella over the past year or so. It was a short story that turned into something much more. And I took a hiatus not only to do research about something that I won't spoil for you, but to clear my mind and step away from the story for a moment. Lately, the ending has been roiling in my mind, and the final chapters of this story wish to be born. So as I read back through what I have written, I figured I would do it on stream so you could join me in anticipation for the climax. This isn't my normal stream. I don't know if it caters to my normal audience, but please enjoy. In the night, it was out there somewhere, stalking through the trees, hungering for death. It did not want the remains of its victims as far as Jim knew. In every case where a body was found, that body had been left to fertilize the soil. In cases where the body was not found, however, the mystery held its most macabre questions. Jim glanced at the tree line, thinking to himself that the gnarled oaks and barren balsams looked like frozen black lightning jutting up from the ground, silhouetted against the dark blue tinted moon and sparse clouds. The old mossy stone wall which marked the northern perimeter of the settlement, 3 feet high in some places and crumbled completely in others, buzzed with the sound of crickets and nocturnal insects. The scene, completed by the grass and scrubs which would sway only slightly against the breeze before standing erect again, gave an impression of peacefulness in this late fall season. However, Jim was anything except at peace. There was something out there that had been taking the villagers' lives, the method of which was the most prominent fear in the young man's mind. Each recovered corpse was riddled with deep lacerations down to the muscle and bone, never deep enough to break the general form of the victim. The cuts were only so deep to strike the bone and sever the muscles from themselves. Each cut in a victim was vertical along their anatomy and numerous enough that some had speculated the mutilations must have continued to occur after death. In the cases where the face was left intact, and intact was relative in this case, fear was a constant between each victim, an unmistakable visage of abject and unadulterated horror. Jim did his best to clear his mind, but even the stones, the grass, and the dirt beneath his feet threatened him with their hidden blades. Nobody alive had laid eyes on the creature, and this much he knew. The rest was a mystery still in the making. Certain nights when people had disappeared, people in the village would claim to have heard a howling from the forest. But this was not unusual, as wolves and foxes were prominent in the area. On one occasion, Addie, daughter of Jeremiah, had described a sound like a man in the trees, she had said, and I heard him moving along the treetops, sickly calling to anybody that would listen. It spent some time in the juniper patch before going silent. It wanted me to come out of our house, but I didn't. Then, sometimes later, as I was drifting to sleep, I heard it again, in the trees above Lover's Path. It was asking, Who will come? Who will help me? Who will be so kind? But I prayed to the Lord and felt that it must be demonic, so I did not reply. At this point, Addie had started to cry, and the village elders told her not to focus, but rather to focus again on her verses, to recite Isaiah 41:10. Some had prodded her for answers after the fact, and rumor was that Addie had heard an innocent owl, which her night terrors had exacerbated into something more, but nobody knew for sure. The entirety of Have Hollow felt like it was on the edge of a blade, ready to sink down, ready to be cut, and the fear bled through each of their days, even when the sun was bright above and avian stragglers chirped happily southward. Jim realized he'd been holding his breath, and conscientiously unlatched his lungs in a slow rattle which he did his best to steady. The cloud from his breath dissipated and crept outward in his vision, so at one point he did not know if he was seeing his own vitae or the mist which crept outward from the tree line. Pulling his coat tightly around him, he felt the core of his chest tremble, solidified and steady in warmth. He tilted his chin down, nestling his beard into his collar for insulation, and scanned the forest again. With his right hand, he used his flintlock rifle to steady himself like a walking stick, and it might have afforded him as much protection as a walking stick, he thought. The captain of the guard, Harris, had been a burly brick house of a man, and he had been missing for almost a week now, having disappeared from the shift that was now attended in pairs, the shift which he was currently watching. "It's a shame about Isaac," Jim croaked, glancing in Zeke's direction. Zeke was like a statue sitting atop the wall. Like a gargoyle coming to life, Jim swore he heard the old man's bones creak as he broke his gaze from that dark wood and turned to face him. "It's an unpopular opinion, but he may have died for his sins." Jim stammered, not knowing exactly how to reply. "But he... It's no secret that he'd been with Eve. Now Isaac's dead, and Eve's own father has also paid the price." Zeke spared another moment of his gaze before turning back to the forest and sitting silently again. Jim didn't want to believe that Harris had died for his daughter's promiscuity. It just didn't fit into what he knew about God. He is vengeful, but isn't he also forgiving? "God would never kill like this," Jim rebuked. "It's too ugly, too savage." Zeke tilted his head, and Jim knew he had made a good point. "I know that all things on earth are tools to his end, but this hasn't felt right since Isaac's face flashed through Jim's mind in life and in grisly death. He fell silent again. Of the dead who had been recovered, one pattern had been observed, but it was a pattern too grisly to focus on for long, for sake of one's own sanity. Isaac had been the first to disappear, and among the last to have been found. Autopsies were not a common or accepted practice at this point in time, but surface inspection for any sort of clue had become the norm with recent killings. Isaac had almost deteriorated beyond recognition by the time he had been found, but certain observations had been made. His body had been marred with the signature wounds, with two exceptions. The vertical cuts were not as deep as the others, and there was one horizontal fissure, shallow, but from ear to ear across the boy's neck. The bodies of the others were found in a random order. Cheryl by Widow's Creek, Sam by the Greater Crabapple Tree, Effie floating in the Oxbow, others scattered amongst the forest and found besides the trade post trail, friends and acquaintances. Jim almost felt blessed for the first time in his life that he had left his parents behind in Connecticut and had no other family to speak of. The pattern was in the veracity of the murders. As a timeline had been produced, a story slowly emerged. It had been noted that when the bodies were ordered by sequence of disappearance, the mutilations grew steadily worse. The cuts were deeper and more numerous with each later victim. The most recent to be discovered had been identified by their families via the clothing that they were wearing. This was immensely traumatizing to their kin, and many requested closed casket funerals, skipping wakes entirely. Though this was frowned upon at first, many accepted it as the only decent way, opting to lay the bodies to rest as soon as possible. Quite the coincidence, then. Jim couldn't help but agree, though he did not say it. I would venture to say that certain sins have come to bear bitter fruit. With this, Zeke shuddered and seemed to shrink underneath his poncho. A ripple under his attire hinted at a gesture Jim had seen Zeke perform many times before, and he knew Zeke was gripping the cross which hung from his necklace. I'm ready to pay for mine own. No. You're a good man, Ezekiel. Among the best, do you hear me? Jim had, without realizing, approached Zeke and rested his hand upon his shoulder. For a moment they stayed this way, comforted by each other's presence. Jim then realized that the sound of insects had altogether stopped. The stillness of the night was inharmoniously shattered by the sound of a snapping twig and the rapidly approaching dissonance of crunching leaves. Chapter 2. The Beast. Jim spun on his heels while raising his rifle, bending his knees in anticipation to fire. His eyes had enough time to catch the moonlight reflecting off something sharp, which whistled through the air at him. The creature, specter, thing, whatever it was, had the jump, and before Jim could aim fully or pull the trigger, he felt the bite of those sharp scourges embed themselves deeply atop his firing arm. They dragged downward, opening the skin along his shoulder in 3 wide swaths, ripping into his bicep. Jim lost control of that arm entirely, and his rifle spun stupidly around his finger, falling from his grip. Blood, like prisoners making flight during a jailbreak, escaped his wounds, misting and spurting chaotically across the creature's form. That moment felt a lifetime, and his adrenaline allowed him to catch a visage of the creature, mostly obscured by the contrast of darkness. The talons which cut him protruded from the arm of a hulking figure, whose shadowy form seemed to ripple like a cape in the breeze. The other arm of the beast was already raised up to follow up, and was tipped with some sort of crescent blade, shining against the stars. However, it was the creature's face which burned itself into the recesses of his mind. The skin was featureless and rough, besides a tiny childish mouth cemented in a cat-like smile, and 2 round openings where the eyes were sunk so far inward that they too were wreathed in darkness. As the thing reared back to strike again, a single moonbeam illuminated the creature's face further, and Jim distinguished 2 points of light in those holes, refracting the night like bloody rubies. Jim's right arm fell limp to his side, and pain finally caught up to his wound, shooting through him like an electric snake. The creature brought the crescent blade down towards the center of his forehead in an intended kill stroke. However, metal rang against metal, and Jim realized he had unsheathed his spadroon without thinking. Blocking the blow with his remaining sword arm, he bent his knees to brace. Iron scraped, and sparks flew as crescent met hilt. The force of this blow knocked Jim backward, and he fell into the grass hard on his tailbone. The sound of violent scraping had intermingled with wild screams, and it seemed Zeke had found his voice. He was yowling wildly, unintelligibly. The creature whirled around to face Zeke, and Jim could see that the old man had brandished his own rifle. Zeke aimed for the head of the creature and pulled the trigger. There was a click, and silence. The gun was jammed. The creature dropped low, voraciously bellowing. It charged Zeke, catching him with its shoulder under his diaphragm. Zeke was lifted into the air and pinned against a tree. The poor fellow's breath left his body, which made an involuntary sound like a broken forge bellow. Jim screamed Zeke's name in horror as he watched his old friend's head roll from side to side. The creature held him there for a moment before releasing, and Zeke crashed limply in a pile at the foot of the tree. For the second time, Jim had unconsciously unsheathed a weapon, the pistol he kept in his boot. The weapon was already aimed at the beast, and Jim pulled the trigger. Thankfully, the weapon fired. The creature was struck in the back that same instant, and it faltered, but only for a moment before it turned and ran screaming like a banshee into the woods, arms stretched out to either side. Its footsteps were heavy against the ground, and Jim's vision blurred. He realized he had instinctively reached into his ammo pouch for another paper cartridge, but he recognized the futility of this action, and his mind turned instead to Zeke. Oh, poor Zeke. He withdrew his hand from his pouch, and paper cartridges spilled out across the grass. He rolled over and clambered to his knees, stumbling towards Zeke as quickly as he could. He saw now that several lights in the town had been lit, and people were peering from their windows or cautiously approaching from their doorsteps, weapons drawn. Zeke's collapsed form drew in a rattly breath and peered up to him. His mouth attempted to form a word, but the old man was weak and his head quickly fell back to the ground, lips still wrapped around whatever he was trying to say. "Zeke, don't speak. Help is coming. They'll fix you up, okay?" Jim gripped his arm above the bicep and could feel his blood oozing in torrents over his fingers. He did his best to squeeze his own arm to stop the flow, but his wound was massive and he couldn't think of where to start. He was already feeling deathly faint and instead turned his attention to Zeke. "Just don't speak. Save your energy." Another slow, creaking breath inward, and Zeke tried to form the word again. "Church. I heard." He breathed in again, and now Jim didn't tell him to stop. He let go of his own arm and began to rub the old man's back softly. He knew these were dying words and could feel the weight of importance hanging between them. Zeke was curled like a sad dog, and Jim could feel at least one place along his back where the spine felt completely out of place. His tears began to flow as freely as his blood, and Jim was exhausted. He himself collapsed to the ground in his own wounded arm, and he was now face to face with the old man, on the precipice of lucidity. He took Zeke's hand, now wrapped again around his cross, into his own hand and squeezed. Jim's words erupted in a slobbery mess. "What did you hear?" And he locked eyes with Zeke, whose own eyes had begun to roll back in his head. His death rattle came in a barely perceivable final message. "The Frenchman." Zeke's hand went limp, and Jim knew he was dead. He rolled onto his back and faded out. His hand had somehow gripped Zeke's cross, and as he rolled, the necklace came free in his grip. The last things he saw before darkness were the stars in the night sky swimming above him and the silhouettes of villagers' faces as they reached downward, gripping him. His survival was now in their hands. Chapter 3. Respite. The next weeks were a blur for Jim. October was approaching, harvesting season was coming to a close, and the whole settlement was hunkering down for another harsh winter. Thomas, the village doctor, had done his best to treat Jim's wounds, but an infection had begun to spread fairly early on, threatening to rot into his bicep. It wasn't gangrenous, but the doctor sought external help. Luckily for Jim, or maybe it made no difference, some speculated, the native tribes had chosen to band together in a nearby valley for the coming winter, and they were only half a day's ride away. Over the past 25 years, the settlement had begun something of a relationship with a certain White River Ute tribe, and this aided in the trade that took place. Godfrey, one of the heads of church, and son of a founder, traded a foal for the time of a native medicine man. The tribe insisted that since the snow would come any day, Jim would have to be transported to them for their assistance. He remembered chanting in a language he did not know, and the burning application of salves to his wounds. It was a fever dream that he could not understand fully. He had melted in and out of hot darkness for countless days as multiple medicine men took turns praying, feeding, and tending to him. During this time, Jim had taken to gripping Zeke's cross, as it was the only thing that brought him some sense of connection with what he considered civilized life. However, he had trust, as the Ute's medicines and methods had proven effective in the past. And so it was that Jim would gain his lucidity again in a willow wickiup, smoke and calmness hanging thick in the air. He turned on his sleeping pad and cleared his throat, opening his eyes. A man with braids down to his waist, wearing a beaded outfit and a modestly ornate headdress, was peering through the smoke at him. The front of the structure had no door, and Jim thought that the sun, hanging late in the sky, looked somewhat like a halo around the man's head. "Make." Was that a question? "Make. I feel better." Jim's voice felt like leaves crunching in his gullet. In truth, he was ready to go home. The man lowered his head, a sign of respect, and raised it again. "Better." The man pointed at Jim. "You strong." Jim looked down at his arm, which was dressed in cotton. It was sore beyond belief, but still attached to his body, which came as a surprise. When Jim looked up again, the man was already lifting himself from where he sat, cross-legged, and turning to leave. Thank you. The man paused to turn and lowered his head slightly again. When he spoke, he used his hands to gesture to get the message across. Friends, give horses. Tava rises. You will ride. It took Jim a moment to respond. I will ride home tomorrow? His voice, unused for weeks, was beginning to feel stronger again already. The man nodded slowly in affirmation. Tomorrow you will ride. Jim nodded back at the man, the facts of the situation dawning on him. The natives may have saved his arm or even his life, and Jim was beyond rapture grateful for them. Thank you, he began to say over and over and over again. Thank you so much. It was all he could think to do. The man spared one more respectful bow of his head before turning to leave the structure. Jim realized he'd been gripping Zeke's cross necklace again, which was hanging around his neck. He also realized something else. Something like a bitter taste right on the tip of his tongue. He knew not when over the past odd days he had begun to realize it, but the necklace held a secret. The cross was heavier than it should have been, and it felt off balance. The weight distribution was wrong, and the bottom part of the cross felt loose. He began tentatively playing with it in his uninjured hand and quickly discovered that the bottom section was, in fact, slightly loose. He played with it for a while, jiggling it back and forth before it occurred to him to turn it. Jim stuck the cross into his mouth and bit down, turning it with his fingers, and instantly felt it click. The whole bottom section slid away entirely. He turned what was left and held it so the late-day sun could illuminate its form fully. The protrusion that had been hidden under the sheath was uneven on one side and flat on the other. It took him a moment to fully recognize what he was looking at. It was a key of some sort. Jim naturally had questions. His thoughts turned to the townspeople, of the beast and of the church. He thought of Zeke's dying words, and he was deeply troubled. The Frenchman, Claude, was the only Frenchman in town and one of the heads of church. And the church. Zeke was one of the original founders of the village and had helped build the church. Since then, Zeke spent his entire life tending to the temple gardens and cleaning the dust from the pews and decorations. He was the caretaker of that holy place. But what did it all mean? Jim couldn't put the pieces together, but something larger was taking shape, some bigger picture. He could feel it in his soul, that though he was alive, he was still in the woods, plagued by darkness wherever he sought the light of truth, being stalked by that beast who tried to take his life. Jim barely slept that night, but by the first sign of daybreak, was ready and full of new energy, departing back to the settlement on horseback. Chapter 4. Changes. Jim's return to the settlement felt much like passing through a forming wind and into the eye of a storm. All attention was on him for the first day, as he was the only person to have seen the beast and lived. And he had told his story multiple times more than he cared to. The townsfolk ate up his description of the baby-faced hulk with blades for arms, but seemed just as quick to try and eject the disturbing picture from their minds. However, after that, he was appointed to Zeke's old job tending the church. No pressure. Take your time, old boy, Claude had said, and suddenly the attention was gone again. That was perfectly wrong time. People were too focused on a separate tragedy that had taken place a week prior, and they couldn't stop talking about it, speculating. Why had Eve ended her own life? It wasn't too hard to imagine. Her father and suitor had both been taken from her. And tending to the farm on her lonesome was a lot of pressure. However, her neighbors had reached out and provided help to finish the harvest, which had been successful. What people stirred about, though, were the rumors that she had left a note. A long letter that had mysteriously disappeared after her body had been unstrung from the barn rafters. People said that she wrote about only ever wanting to be a mother but not with Isaac, that all men are violent even when they have good intentions, and the most troubling detail of all, that she could no longer go on living with what she had helped to hide. These details had been relayed by Marion, who had responded to Eve's request to arrive that day and help her sort her harvesting tools, who swore up and down that the letter existed, but she could no longer find it. Jim was not a religious man when he had come to the settlement, though his parents had been. However, some part of him wanted to believe, and he attended the Mass on Sundays. It turned out that Zeke had left a will stating that Jim could have all of his personal belongings, as Zeke had no heirs of his own. Jim collected these things from Quill, one of the heads of church. The possessions included the key to Zeke's humble cottage in the churchyard. Upon visiting that place, Jim immediately noticed that it looked ransacked, though the door had been locked on his arrival. This was uncharacteristic of Zeke. Jim had come to that place many times to play chess with the chap, and it was never in disarray like this. Jim felt he had placed an important detail. Someone in the church, perhaps even Claude, whom Jim was now deeply wary of, may have taken the key if it was discovered with Zeke's body. Quite the coincidence, then, that you would end up with that in your palm. Jim could hear the voice of his dead friend as he cleaned up and organized. There weren't many possessions, a pouch of tobacco and a corncob pipe being the most valuable, and Jim tucked these away in a jacket pocket. After he finished, he sat on the old man's cot and looked around. There was nothing, no lockbox or secret compartments that the key could fit into. Jim pulled it from under his shirt and held it in the light. "What is this for, Zeke?" Zeke was there, standing in front of him, gripping the cross as he always had, and the two were face to face. The old man looked as stern as ever, furrowing his brow as he spoke. "I really couldn't tell you, son, seeing how I'm just a memory. But I propose you just keep looking." He could still feel Zeke there beside him as he walked among the church garden, familiarizing himself with the mostly wilted perennials, and could see him in his mind's eye, praying at the cross as Jim did his best to sweep between the pews. Jim would unsling his arm, and though he couldn't bend at the elbow all that well anymore, and could barely curl most of his fingers on that hand, he made himself useful however he could. As the weeks drew on, Jim noticed that more and more of the townsfolk were performing the sacraments to convert to Catholicism, with Claude leading many of these rites. The Sunday sermon was also focused on conversion, and communion was held, which wasn't traditional in that settlement, which had been Presbyterian as long as Jim could remember. Usually, they only held communion once a month. He attributed this to Joseph, who had been appointed the new third head of church now that Zeke was dead. The heads of church were now mostly Catholic, and though Quill had historically been a Presbyterian as well, he didn't seem to object in any way and also underwent the sacraments of conversion. Over the course of the previous week, Jim would see these changes taking place while scouring every inch of the church for anything that his key might open. His mind was drawn to the events that happened nearly 10 years ago, only months after his arrival in Have Hollow. Claude's father, Gascoigne, had attempted reverting the settlement back to Catholicism himself. He, in a small section of the community, had led a month-long protest that Catholicism was the way, but then things got weird. There was a string of seemingly random brutal murders, each perpetrator different than the last. each butchery seemingly unrelated. Catholics and Presbyterians dying alike, and the community felt it must set aside its differences and band together. People also began complaining of ghastly night visions, and some form of hysteria led the townsfolk to hunt down a self-proclaimed witch who lived in a wooded shack some ways to the north. Cheryl was her name, and her husband, prior to these events, had made great contributions in the foundings of the town. However, she was dead. She had no children of her own. It seemed the townsfolk were happy to let her live at arm's length until they needed someone to blame, and they flooded her shack one starless night, taking their vengeance for her witchcraft. They brutalized her at the trial, and her bones still rested at the bottom of the oxbow, bound to a boulder. However, the murders stopped, and the visions stopped, and the townspeople seemed content that their gamble paid off, their shot in the dark, so to speak. Jim didn't believe in witchcraft or even God at the time, not in the slightest. He voiced this to an older gentleman weeks after the trial, as his own mind couldn't flush the horrifying end Cheryl had met, and that was the first time he had heard Zeke mutter the words, "Quite the coincidence, then." This got them talking, and before long they were seldom seen apart. Jim was setting the broom back into the church storeroom when he knocked a row of gardening tools over. Their combined weight turned a wine barrel on its side. A hoop snapped and the head came ajar, gushing its contents all over the floor. Jim did his best to right the barrel as quickly as possible, cursing and straining himself, and was just barely able to save a little over half of the wine, the rest of it needlessly quenching the stonework underfoot. The cacophony had subsided, but the ensuing silence was not comfortable. There were tools lying about, wet with wine, and the floor was a mess. The sound of dripping reverberated dimly through the storeroom, and Jim covered his face, thinking about what to do next. Jim's pants were covered in wine, and it occurred to him they might be perceived as a drunkard in some rotten twist of luck. But he couldn't concentrate. Something was wrong. Not wrong, no, just off. That same bitter taste was on the tip of his tongue again now, and he could almost perceive the flavor. It was wine? The sound of dripping continued, and Jim sprang into action, snatching up armfuls of tools as quickly as he could and moving them away from the walls. He hoisted himself onto the table and slid the dusty window open to better illuminate the room. Now that the late sun could fully illuminate his surroundings, he looked down, and the answer was there, staring back at him. The bubbles in that thick red liquid were streaming into a V shape, pointing like an arrow to the eastern wall. He dropped from the table right into the middle of it and listened again, feeling along the wall for anything out of place. Sure enough, the dripping was coming from the other side. The wine was leaking into some sort of chamber behind the wall. "You're right there, Jim." Zeke's voice was behind him again, egging him to keep looking. Jim slid his fingers underneath each stone jutting out from the wall and ran them along the mortar, feeling for any sort of opening. His heart was trying to beat its way out of his chest, and his adrenaline was turning every bump and crack he could feel into a visceral valley, a barrow, ripe for exploration. "It's only a matter of time now," Zeke said, laughing again. And then Jim's fingers slid into a hole at the intersection of 4 wall stones near the corner of the room. He pulled his pinky from the cavity and stooped down to peer inside. There it was, a steel keyhole in the impression. Jim had already doffed the necklace, unsheathing it once again. He stood up fully and steadied himself, pressing the cross into the hole. "You do remember I helped build this place, right? I'm one of the few living souls that still knows about this." "Well," Zeke's voice trailed off. The solid crunch of pins being lifted from their housing made Jim smile, and he turned the key. The stonework of the wooden door was composed of rocks, busted in half and mortared in place to disguise the opening. As the door swung outward, Jim realized that the hinges had been cleverly disguised as the edge of a wall rack. The pent-up wine splashed freely down into the opening. As Jim's eyes adjusted to what lay beyond, the smile slowly left his face. He had expected Well, he didn't know what he had expected. Perhaps a book with all the answers in it. Some other clue. Instead, he found a ladder, which ascended downward into some sort of crawl space, and a narrow passageway that stretched into the darkness to the left behind the walls of the church. Jim stayed there, frozen for a time, veins iced over as he listened for a moment for any sort of movement. His hair stood on end, and a feeling of dread steadily permeated him to the marrow. But then the trance was broken by a voice. It was not the voice of Zeke, however, it was the voice of Claude in the main hall. Jim? Jim, I need your help with something. Jim weighed his options, and he knew he had to move. He did not know what compelled him to enter the passageway, but he did, and he began to pull the door shut behind him, stonework grinding. Claude's footsteps echoed through the hall as he rapidly approached. Jim heaved hard with his good arm and felt the latch of the door engage, clicking into place. Gripping the ladder tightly, Jim was engulfed by darkness, holding his breath in an attempt to remain silent. Chapter 5. Confessional. Jim stayed right there, gripping the ladder, eyes wide, searching for any light. On the other side of the wall, he heard Claude stop as he entered the storeroom. Claude was silent for a moment, and then... Oh, wow. Can't even bung the wine like a normal human being. You had to go and break into it like an animal. Perfect. This is perfect. I don't have time for this. Claude's voice trailed off, and the sound of footsteps plodded away back to the main hall. Jim looked around again. His eyes were beginning to adjust to the near pitch-black darkness, but he could see a faint light down the hallway to his left. Turning sideways, he slipped through the corridor carefully with his hand held high in front of his face. As he traversed, the light became brighter by modicums until he recognized the source. It was a set of two glass windows. One was set into the outer wall, and the other was set into the inner wall to allow light to pass through. However, this particular window was thick and distorted, and only shadows and vague shapes could be observed through it. Jim recognized this as the window behind the confessional booth, and as he approached, he heard voices there. Softly, unintelligible at first, but increasing in volume as he approached, so he could make out snippets of the conversation. Fine, Jim. Wine all over. He's too drunk to walk. A second voice. Figures. There were more whispers, and Jim was careful not to make any noise as he made his final approach, ducking low so his silhouette couldn't be seen through the glass. He was now directly behind the confessional between the two sheets of glass, and he felt a draft where there was a gap between the stones on the inner wall. He pressed his ear to the gap and could hear the conversation clearly. Claude's voice was uniquely thick with his French accent. Body was just found. He had been skinned from head to toe, but there's no question, it is him. His gardening tools and his clothes were found scattered nearby. However, Dmitri says he's been dead for at least 2 weeks. These last 2 words, 2 weeks, were emphasized, still hushed, but loudly, panicked. There was a pause, and then the second unknown voice. That doesn't make any sense. Joel died, what was it, 6 days ago, and now Quill. Someone is taking advantage of the situation. Claude paused before continuing. Quill was found this morning. Dmitri says he was killed sometime last night. It couldn't have been. Claude seemed to lose his train of thought. The second voice picked up where Claude left off. Right. It couldn't have been him anyways, so what do we do? Claude didn't speak again for almost 30 seconds. When he did speak, his voice was shaky and unsure. Okay. Post 2 new guards, able-bodied this time, who own firearms. People we don't mind losing. but who can handle themselves. Nobody else needs to die. People are already talking. There are rumors about a second killer. This might play in our favor if we can catch whoever is doing this. Right. People won't be focused on... Exactly, Claude affirmed. Now we just have to catch the second killer. Claude paused for another brief moment and then whispered, Go now. You're excused. Jim could hear the old hinges of the confessional groan in protest and a knocking sound as one party departed, then near a minute later again as the second party took their leave. Jim stayed that way, crouched in the corridor for what felt like a lifetime, attempting to process what he had just heard. When his awareness finally re-arose from the depths of thought, there was a moment of stress. He realized his leg had become slightly lodged between the two walls, and the grip of claustrophobia took root. He twisted his leg to unjam it and had to stand up to do so. Realizing that his form may be perceptible through the window, he turned to his left and pressed onward, scooting sideways through the passageway. Feeling his way through the darkness, it occurred to him that if he became lodged fully between the stones or fell into some hole, there was little to no chance he would be discovered. Now, not only did the walls feel much too tight around him, but he felt utterly alone, pursuing some dark secret in a forgotten place that would brook him no mercy. Before long, he'd come to another ladder, but this one stretched upward. He felt around in the darkness and discovered that this was the only outlet from the hallway besides the direction he came from, so with no other option, he climbed. Reaching the top, he found that there was late daylight seeping in through high, thin gaps in the stonework, and his eyes were much more well adjusted to see here than they were below. The passageway was also wider here, and he was able to turn fully as he traversed the corridor. The path took a left and then ended abruptly. Jim was disappointed, and this turned to frustration as he jarred his hip on something sticking out of the wall. He did his best to stifle a pained groan and began rubbing his hip, where it would surely be bruised, looking down at his inanimate assailant. It was a door latch, like below, and Jim instantly forgot his pain. Listening, he could not sense any movement on the other side, so he gripped the handle. For the second time in the past 5 minutes, his heart began to beat rapidly. His breath also began to falter as he prepared himself for what was on the other side of this door. Supposedly, the heads of church each had a living quarter on the second floor of the church, but Jim had never seen the second floor, as the door up was perpetually locked, save for passage by the occupants. He could sense that he was now on the second floor, likely behind this area, and he knew that if discovered, he would have a hard time explaining himself. He took a moment to steady himself, wondering, Zeke, why would you build all this? And lifted the door latch. Nearly forgotten hinges groaned in protest, reverberating through wavering torchlight and across stone walls as the door opened fully and Jim stepped through. I'm going to pause for a moment because I think someone said what up. I don't think anyone said what up. Chapter 6, where we find our friend Jim deep in something that he does not understand. Den of Shepherds. This area was humble compared to the rest of the church. Constructed of the same stone, but without the ornate decorations and flora which covered the temple downstairs. Only 2 lamps illuminated the entirety of the corridor, and Jim could see 4 doors, entrances to separate rooms, and the staircase downward to the main floor. To his right was the steeply curling staircase to the top of the bell tower. He knew that he must move quickly, and purpose spurred him as he stalked down the hallway, peering into each doorway. To his delight, the doors had no locks. The first room was empty, save for a bed and some clothes, which Jim recognized as quills. The second room, directly across from the first, was exactly the same. However, there was an inkwell and a quill atop the desk inside. It didn't much interest him, and as he passed midway through the hall, he lifted one of the brass lamps from its hook and took it with him. Jim advanced to the third door and found that the room was just like the first two, except there was no writing desk at all, like the first room. The fourth door, though, proved a bit more interesting. It was a library of some sort, and there were two waist-high shelves with what Jim estimated were over 50 books total. One shelf, the larger of the two, was covered in religious books, hymnals, and copies of the Bible in a few different versions. The other shelf was more eclectic. It had nursery rhyme books, some medical journals, scientific texts about anatomy as well as plant life. Some detail now struck Jim as strange, but he couldn't tell what at first. Everything was dusty. He could make out in the light from the hall, except for the hymnals. Those were taken out on a weekly basis and given to the congregation, so this was no surprise. He swept the lamplight across the shelves and saw clearly which books had been handled by their lack of dust. A King James version of the Bible, a collection called Deuterocanonical Contextual Connections, and what seemed to be a scholarly text, Perpetuating Hope via Altruism. None of these seemed that odd, but there was a book from the second shelf which seemed to have been handled heavily. This book was called Inductions and Deductions, Plant Life of the Americas. He pulled it from the shelf and rifled through it quickly, looking for a dog ear or a bookmark, but there wasn't one. He paused on a page about Viburnum trilobum and tried to comprehend a section about its edibility, but quickly realized he was just wasting precious time. He closed the book and tucked it under his arm, glancing again around the library, and then exited back to the hall. He stood a moment and thought to himself, this can't be it. A book on plant life? There has to be something more. And he turned back to the second room, the one with the writing desk and the inkwell. Jim left the door wide so the hall light could illuminate and peeked around. The modest dresser here was filled with garments that Jim had seen Claude wearing, and Jim knew they must be his. Jim immediately set to work, throwing respect to the wind, and began rifling through drawers. There were knickers, robes, breeches, stockings, and then nothing. The whole room was barren besides the writing desk, the dresser, and the immaculately made bed. So why the quill and inkwell? Jim felt around on the desk for a drawer or other hidden compartment, but was quick to relent. The desk was made of solid sheets of wood, and there was no room for things hidden here. He turned his attention to the bed, rustling sheets and lifting padding. His sense of urgency began to take hold, and he soon pulled the bed completely apart, shaking sheets out and flipping the quilt. He could tell that the padding was semi-woolen and was struck with a small amount of jealousy, but this was shadowed completely by his purpose there, and he could feel his time running out. The bed was now in piles, littered throughout the room, and Jim was crawling along the bed frame, searching for what he did not know. He stood back up and turned towards the dresser again, grasping the top drawer and pulling it out fully. As he prepared to peer into the space beyond, he heard the dull flop of something falling to the ground. Whatever it was, it had been somehow fastened or hidden underneath one of the drawers, and Jim had shaken it loose. He looked down. It was another book, but of homemade quality. Sheets of rough parchment were held together with a thin binding of two twine loops. 3 words stood out on the cover of the thing. Claude G. Leroy. Jim was ecstatic and swept the book up from the floor, quickly flipping through it. It was at least 100 pages long, with the sheets themselves varying in quality and age greatly. Jim frantically flipped through the browning parchment, which he quickly realized was coming away from the seam in its old age. His probing slowed, and he began to wonder if he should start at the beginning or near the end. Shifting the weight of the thing, he thunked most of it into his right hand and fanned in a few pages from the oldest entry. He picked a random passage and skimmed it. He would lose interest, flip a few pages, and repeat the process multiple times. Most entries were centered around the boy's father, and his battle to win head of church 12 years prior. His father had been ill in his old age and required a great deal of care. There were a great deal of passages pertaining to the boy's father requiring Claude to enact on his behalf in church politics. Finally, he came across a passage that stood out to him as unusual. Father wouldn't say what the plant was, just not to inhale it, to cover my face with a cloth when I carried it, and not to touch it with my bare hands. So I did what he told me, and it's in the well now. I know he knows what it is because he has that book, and I wanted to know too, but he hid the book away. I tried to look for it, but I don't know where he hid it. It only went missing in the last few days. He tells me that it is not poison and that the townspeople will be safe and that I must have faith, so I do. I won't tell anybody, and someday when I am doing God's work, or if not, then when I reach heaven I will know. The passage ended there, and the next entry was marked a whole 2 months later, October of 1723. Jim realized the entry he read was only 2 weeks after his own arrival in town. He skimmed a few pages after that, but it all seemed relatively tame. He was suddenly wondering if any pages had been removed or destroyed. Some days Claude had made an entry every day for weeks on end, but there were lapses in the dates that sometimes lasted months. He flipped towards the final entries and landed on a random passage from a few weeks ago. The only words on the entire page were, in much better handwriting than the earlier years, "The phantasic properties of the red-eye fungus are exacerbated during the night hours, and more so under a fuller moon. The perigee is only days away, and I will appear to him at the cottage at that time. I am not lying when I tell him that I am the voice of God, as I know it is his work that Harris shall do." Jim began to look for the last entry when he heard something that made his blood run cold. The door to the main hall at the bottom of the stairs made a clicking noise as somebody turned the lock, which rang up through the silent hall and struck Jim like a gunshot. He immediately sprang into action, whirling like a cyclone as he exited the room, closing the door behind him. He did his best to keep his footsteps light, jetting back up the corridor toward the secret passageway, but he could hear footsteps coming up the stairs, and his heart jumped into his throat. He knew that whoever was there was only moments away from discovering him, and in that instant he made a decision that barely made sense to him but felt right. He turned and hurled the lamp towards Claude's room, which exploded against the wooden door with the pop of glass, promptly blazing into a brilliant fire which seemed to hang from the stone walls and ceilings. Perhaps this would buy him time and obscure his identity long enough to pull the stone port closed. Turning again, he threw himself headlong into the opening behind the bell tower stairs and heaved against the door with his good arm. He almost caught the visage of the person in the other side of the flames, could see that they had lifted their arms in belligerent tragedy towards the fire, but then the door was shut. He could only hope that they had also not seen him. The sun had gone down by then, and no light came in through the cracks in the ceiling. The flickering of firelight died behind him as he felt for the ladder, stumbling blindly through the darkness. He thought to himself that this feeling was all too familiar, but at least now he had a destination. The cottage from Claude's journal was that cottage. It must be Cheryl's shack, the witch's cursed cottage where none went for fear of magics. Jim reached the ladder, jarring his face against it, though he had raised his arm to prevent this, almost plummeting into that hole. He snaked his arm between two bars and curled around the ladder for his life, books gripped tightly underneath his sling. Jim began to tremble uncontrollably, and it took a great while to correct his own breathing, hanging there against the metal in the pitch darkness. He felt alone in that void, helpless. Solitude suddenly pressed down on him like the weight of an ocean, and tears began to silently escape, falling into the abyss below. There were no answers, just more questions. That's the way it was beginning to feel. He didn't know who to trust, and his only friend in this place was buried in a hole somewhere. He could feel the pieces of this puzzle falling into place, but the picture that was forming was too fiendish for him. It was then that Jim began to lose hope. But in his mind's eye, he could see Zeke there with him again. It's always darkest just before the dawn, friend. You'll see the light. These were things Zeke had said in life. Was it just his own imagination, or was his friend there with him? The smell of smoke roused him from this state, and he relaxed a bit. He carefully placed his feet against the holds and corrected his balance. Breathing deeply, Jim began his descent. Chapter 7. Predator and Prey. A human's eyes can adjust to even the slightest moonbeam, seeping through the cracks of stony walls. It might take a while, but eventually vague shapes may be recognized. In bitter irony, when you attentively look at anything, it disappears into blackness, yet your peripherals maintain their ability to feed your brain grayscale specters of your surroundings. Jim became aware of this phenomena as he made for the final secret passageway, the ladder down underneath the storeroom to God knows where. He took hold of the first steel rung, steeled himself, and kicked on his autopilot. He knew if he thought too hard about what he was doing, he might hesitate, or even fall into the gorge of his own doubt again. There was a dull, reverberating thud of metal as he passed hand under hand and ventured downward. Rather quickly, he felt his foot strike the permanence of earth, and he knew he was at the church's foundation. At first, it seemed that there was nowhere to go, that the constricted shaft ended here, with 4 unyielding walls around him. Then he remembered the crawl space he had seen earlier at about knee height opposite the ladder. The ground was wet with wine, and his boots squelched through the mud as he stooped to one knee. Before him stretched the faceless yawn of darkness, and he began to crawl forward into the 3-foot-high stone opening. He was suddenly aware of his own unshakable resolution, solid in the core of his being. It was this smelted iron light which he recognized as his own hunger for truth that kept him going. That and the presence of his good friend Zeke, who had taught him that there was order in the universe. He kept crawling even when it turned pitch black. He became aware that the ground was softer than he expected shortly before he began crashing through some sort of assemblages which were clinging to the walls. They increased in density as the passageway drew on, and at one point he was surrounded on all sides by them, to the point where he wondered if he could continue. But he did, and what felt like bulbs of plant matter came away from the wall. A thick scent filled his nostrils, and he coughed involuntarily, receiving a cluster of whatever this stuff was into his open mouth. He instantly spit it out, but a thick, bitter dust left a dense taste in his mouth. He pressed onward, continuing to attempt to clear his throat. He hadn't progressed very far into the hole, but he calculated that it ran along the edge of the building, just behind the south wall. If it continued to the opposite end of the building, he was probably a third of the way across. The sudden strike of claustrophobia kicked in again, and he had never experienced the sensation before. All at once, the taste in his mouth had grown into a feeling behind his eyes, and it didn't seem to stop growing in intensity like tinder becoming a fire. However, he pressed on, even when he could feel the cobwebs begin clustering on his face and arms, and tiny feet skittered across his exposed flesh. Jim felt the little creatures biting him relentlessly, but he pressed on. Elsewhere, an owl skimmed just above the forest. Its eyes were pointed through a channel of treetops honed in on a dark mass which crashed through the foliage some 250 yards away. The owl's eyes made out great detail in that moment. The creature, it could see, was a hulking mass of black shadows whose red eyes streaked through the night. The owl let out 3 distinct hoots in rapid succession, banking upward. Below was a cabin, long fallen into disrepair, the wooden door detached in some age past. Grass and weeds had taken foothold within the abode. The room was modestly furnished with 2 makeshift beds and a nightstand with no drawers. The personal belongings that littered the room were mostly clothes, and were all completely moth-eaten or destroyed, except for a Bible, which rested on the larger bed. This clearing was lower than other areas, the ground moist. This contributed to a rather rampant amount of fungus which covered the low-lying wood of the cabin and speckled the trees in bulbous clusters. A wolf was nearby, examining the remains of a temporary structure. The make was familiar to the wolf, and so she saw it, where others may not have. The walls of the structure had already been removed, but the wooden skeleton lay intact. It seemed the structure had not been used as a shelter, as it was much too small. In the center was a fire pit whose stones had been scattered. The wolf pawed into the ash and cocked its head to the side, as faint but familiar herbs permeated her senses. She pondered, troubled. It was then that she heard the owl above. 3 hoots. That meant the creature they had been tracking had been spotted. However, the wolf had one other question. There were fading human scents which she recognized, but there were also 2 very fresh scents which she felt safe presuming were the scents of the settlers. It had began raining, and she wanted to examine the scene while it was still fresh. Both were present on a trail that she knew led to the white settlers. One scent had been all over the inside of the cabin and in the surrounding area. The other scent she had tracked to just outside the cabin's bedside shutter. And now she confirmed again. It seemed that the other individual had only ever approached the cabin at that specific window, but had never entered the cabin. Rather, they would make a stop at the front door and then head back to the settlement. The owl hooted again 3 times. Kicking off with her front paws, the wolf spun on her haunches and headed west. And that's that. The story will be finished soon. It's reaching its climax. Most of the clues for what is occurring in this unfortunate early American settlement are in what I have just read. And to the avid clue hunter, you might be able to put together the sequence of events that has occurred up to this point. I'll be containing a few final clues in the climax, which I will be writing shortly. Once I release that, I look forward to hearing what you think. However, if you have any idea what you think is happening, please leave it in the comments below. If you're watching on YouTube, naturally. The story's already written. I didn't write this story. It came to me in fever dreams and has been told through me by the universe. I think as most of the best stories are. And I look forward to revealing what happens in these final couple chapters to the rest of you. But until then, hippies, nerds, cool cats and hip dogs, everything in between, I hope you stay well, stay scary.